The royal chamber hummed with quiet tension as Princess Zelara scanned the glowing hollow scroll before her. The words felt heavier than they should, weighted with duty she had no desire to embrace. Marry Doran Vex or risk war, a choice that was no choice at all. She clenched her jaw, her violet eyes flicking to the towering figure of Commander Taurian standing beside her. "The council expects your announcement by tomorrow," he said, his voice measured, but she could hear the strain beneath. He hated this as much as she did. Zelara exhaled sharply and turned away, packing toward the balcony that overlooked the luminous spires of Eloria's capital. A soft wind carried the scent of flowering Celi's trees, a fragrance that should have been soothing. Instead, it grated against her nerves. "There has to be another way," she murmured. Taurian remained silent, unwilling to offer false hope. The nobility thrived on tradition, and Doran had spent years positioning himself as the only acceptable suitor. His influence stretched too far, his ambition a threat wrapped in the guise of loyalty. Her mother, Queen Valora, had made it clear that the only way to delay the engagement was to present a compelling alternative. Another fiancé, someone the court would accept at least temporarily. The idea had formed in the dead of night, a desperate, reckless solution. A fake betrothal enough to throw Doran off balance and buy time, but it had to be convincing. She had sent the call out to select channels, seeking an off-worlder skilled in deception, someone who could play the role without entanglements. Now she waited. A chime echoed through the chamber. Taurian stiffened as the doors slid open, revealing a cloaked figure flanked by two uneasy guards. The man stepped forward, pulling back his hood, and Zelara's breath hitched, not from awe but disbelief. He was human. Disheveled brown hair, sharp green eyes, a cocky smirk that spoke of confidence bordering on arrogance. He looked utterly out of place in the opulent chamber, yet he held himself with a casual ease, as if strolling into the palace of an alien empire was just another Tuesday. "You've got to be joking," Zelara muttered. The man raised an eyebrow. "Elia's cross at your service. I hear you need a fiancé. Lucky for you I happen to be available." Taurian's hand twitched toward his weapon. Zelara lifted a hand to still him, her mind racing. This was the candidate the network had chosen. A Terran freelancer. Humans weren't unheard of in the Empire, but they were rarely welcomed into noble circles, let alone the royal family. "You intercepted the request?" she asked, her voice carefully neutral. Elias grinned. "Technically, I answered it. The offer was, let's just say, hard to ignore. You're human." "Well spotted, Your Highness." Taurian stepped forward, his tone edged with controlled fury. "This is an insult. A Terran lacks the standing." "I lack a lot of things," Elias interrupted, unbothered. "But if you wanted a noble, you'd have picked one already. You need someone who can sell a lie, keep his cool, and handle himself when things go sideways. That's me." Zelara narrowed her eyes, studying him. He was bold, too bold, but there was something beneath the bravado, a sharpness, an awareness of his surroundings that suggested experience beyond mere arrogance. "The court won't accept you," she said. "They don't have to," Elias replied. "They just have to believe it long enough for you to do whatever it is you're really planning." Her lips pressed together. He wasn't wrong, but this was madness. "You're assuming I'd even consider you." Elias shrugged. "You're assuming you have a better option." Taurian growled under his breath. Zelara turned away, staring out at the city again. He was right. She hated it, but he was right. Time was running out, and this ridiculous gamble was the only play she had left. She turned back to him. "There will be conditions," Elias smirked. "Naturally. You will follow my orders, no improvising, no embellishments. Of course. This arrangement is temporary. When it ends, you disappear, no complications." Elias tilted his head. "Define complications." Taurian took a step closer, his imposing frame casting a shadow over Elias. "If you so much as breathe out of line, I will personally remove you from existence." Elias met the glare with a lopsided grin. "Now see, that is the kind of commitment I like to see in a bodyguard." Zelara pinched the bridge of her nose. "Taurian, stand down." The commander hesitated, then reluctantly stepped back. Zelara took a steadying breath. "Fine, you have the job." Elias spread his arms dramatically. "Fantastic. So when do we start pretending to be madly in love?" Her glare could have melted steel. "Try not to get yourself killed before the first public appearance," she muttered, striding past him. Elias watched her go, then turned to Taurian. She likes me already, doesn't she? Taurian's expression remained unreadable. You will not survive this. Elias grinned. Oh, I like a challenge. Taurian only shook his head, watching as Elias followed the princess into the depths of the palace. The game had begun. The ballroom shimmered with cascading light, refracted through floating prisms that danced in the air. Nobles adorned in flowing silks and crystalline armor moved through the vast chamber like pieces on a game board, each one angling for position. At the heart of it all stood Princess Zelara, poised and regal, her expression unreadable as she awaited the moment she had been dreading all day. Elias Cross adjusted the stiff collar of the ornate navy blue jacket they had given him. It fit too well, which meant someone had measured him while he was unconscious, a detail he decided to let slide for now. The attire was meant to help him blend in, but he felt like a target. "All right, princess," he murmured as he approached her side. "Let's see if your people are as easy to fool as a back-alley arms dealer." Zelara barely glanced at him. "You'll speak only when necessary." Elias smirked. "So you do like me quiet." She turned fully then, and if looks could kill, he'd be ashes on the floor. He held up his hands in mock surrender. Taurian, stationed a few steps behind them, exhaled sharply. "You're drawing attention already." Elias followed his gaze and noted the subtle shifts in the room, glances exchanged, hushed murmurs traveling like ripples in water. The court had expected Zelara to arrive alone. Instead, she had arrived with him. Showtime. Zelara straightened her shoulders as she stepped forward, guiding him through the assembled nobles. The scrutiny was immediate. Elias could practically feel the weight of their stares pressing against his skin. Some were curious, others offended. A few looked downright murderous. At the center of it all stood Doran Vex. He was taller than Elias had expected, broad-shouldered and impeccably dressed in a deep crimson robe that spoke of wealth and influence. His platinum hair was slicked back, and his golden irises gleamed with restrained fury as he took in the scene before him. "Princess Zelara," Doran said smoothly, his voice carefully measured. "You've made an unexpected entrance." Zelara inclined her head just enough to be polite. "I thought it time for some unpredictability." Doran's gaze flicked to Elias. "And who exactly is this?" Elias grinned, stepping forward with a confidence he wasn't entirely sure he had earned. "Elias Cross, fiancé to the princess." Silence. A dangerous silence. Elias could feel the collective breath of the room catch, tension coiling like a wire about to snap. Doran's smile didn't falter, but there was something behind his eyes now, something calculating. A human. His tone was casual, but it was clear he was speaking for the benefit of the gathered court. "Surely you jest, princess." Zelara didn't flinch. "I do not." Elias wrapped an arm around her waist before she could react, pulling her just close enough to appear convincing. He felt her muscles stiffen under his touch, but she didn't pull away. He leaned in slightly as if sharing an intimate secret. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Doran, was it? Zelara told me so much about you. Lies, but good ones." Doran's smile tightened. "Fascinating. And how exactly did you capture the heart of our dear princess?" Elias feigned thoughtfulness, his grip on Zelara's waist shifting slightly. "Oh, you know, the usual, saved her life. Had a few late-night talks under alien moons. I'd say it was destiny, but really I think she just likes my winning personality." Zelara subtly dug her nails into his wrist in warning. He suppressed a smirk. Doran's expression barely flickered, but Elias could see the gears turning. He wasn't buying it, not yet. A new voice cut through the conversation. "I must say this is unorthodox." Elias turned to find a regal woman stepping forward, her presence alone commanding the space. Queen Valora, Zelara's mother. She was taller than her daughter, her robes a deep indigo threaded with silver that shimmered in the light. Her expression was unreadable, but her sharp gaze pinned Elias where he stood. "Your Majesty," Elias said, dipping into a slight bow. He had no idea what the proper etiquette was, but he figured making an effort wouldn't hurt. Valora's gaze remained steady. "You claim to be betrothed to my daughter." "That's right. And yet I have never heard your name before today." Elias smiled easily. "We wanted to keep things quiet until the right moment." He glanced at Zelara, softening his voice just enough to sell it. "This wasn't about politics for us. It was about us." Zelara played her part well, tilting her head slightly as if touched by the sentiment. The queen studied him for an agonizingly long moment before speaking again. "You must understand the gravity of this declaration, Mr. Cross. My daughter is not merely a woman of status. She is heir to an empire. If this is a deception—" "It's not," Zelara interrupted, her voice steady. "Elias is my chosen." Valora's gaze flickered with something unreadable. Then she turned her attention back to Elias. "You will prove it," Elias' brow lifted. "How so?" The queen's expression remained impassive. "A royal bond must be demonstrated before the court. If this is real, then a kiss should be no obstacle." Elias stiffened slightly, and for the first time Zelara hesitated. Doran's smirk returned. He was enjoying this. Elias exhaled, then turned to Zelara, lowering his voice so only she could hear. "You want to tell me what happens if I mess this up? Scandal, disgrace, potential execution." He let out a low whistle. "No pressure, then." Zelara lifted her chin, her jaw tight, but she didn't back down. She had committed to this ruse, and now there was no turning back. Elias cupped her face gently, tilting it just so. Her skin was cool beneath his fingers, her breath even but controlled. She was bracing herself. He could hear the silence stretching around them, the anticipation of the court. Then with calculated slowness, he leaned in. Their lips met. It was brief, measured. Not too eager, not too stiff, just enough to be convincing. But for all its intent, Elias felt the shift the moment it happened. Zelara's fingers curled against his jacket, a barely perceptible hesitation. Her body remained still, but for a fraction of a second, something in her composure slipped. Then the moment passed. When they pulled apart, the silence in the ballroom had changed. It wasn't suspicion anymore. It was intrigue. Valora studied them a moment longer, then finally inclined her head. "Very well. The engagement is acknowledged." Doran's expression darkened. Taurian, from his place near the perimeter, remained unreadable. Elias let out a slow breath, still holding Zelara's gaze. She looked almost unsettled. Interesting. Elias barely had time to register the shift in Zelara's expression before the murmurs of the court rippled through the ballroom like a low tide. The kiss had convinced them for now, but he knew how these things worked. Nobles would whisper behind closed doors, speculation would breed doubt, and doubt would give way to scrutiny. He had bought them time, but not security. Zelara stepped back first, smoothing the fabric of her gown as if nothing had happened. She didn't look at him. Not directly. Not yet. Elias knew better than to call attention to it. Instead, he turned his focus to the queen, who regarded him with the unreadable gaze of someone playing a game 10 moves ahead. "It is settled, then," Valora said, her voice carrying across the chamber with quiet authority. "Princess Zelara has chosen her consort, and the court shall recognize this union." Doran's smile was carved from glass, polished, yet brittle. "How fortunate for us all." Elias met his gaze, reading between the lines. Doran hadn't lost, not yet. The challenge was far from over. Before any more could be said, the queen turned to a tall, robed figure standing at the edge of the dais. The royal officiant. "Prepare the formal decree. The engagement shall be recorded by nightfall." The moment those words left her lips, the air in the room shifted. This wasn't just an announcement anymore. It was law. Elias felt Zelara stiffen beside him, her breath measured but tense. He supposed it was one thing to craft a lie and another to see it woven into the very fabric of an empire. Valora glanced once more at Elias, her expression still unreadable. "We will speak soon." And with that she turned, her attendants moving like shadows in her wake as she departed through an archway of woven light. Doran lingered, his golden eyes sharp as he stepped closer. "You have quite the talent for spectacle," he murmured, his voice low enough that only Elias and Zelara could hear. Elias shrugged, keeping his tone light. "What can I say? I'm adaptable." Doran tilted his head slightly, studying him like a scientist might examine an unfamiliar specimen. "Tell me, Elias Cross, do you truly understand what you've involved yourself in?" Elias let the question hang between them, waiting just long enough to make it clear he wasn't intimidated. Then he smiled. "I tend to figure things out as I go." Doran exhaled a quiet chuckle. "Let's hope you survive long enough to do so." With that he turned and strode away, disappearing into the murmuring crowd. The moment he was gone, Zelara grabbed Elias' wrist, her grip deceptively strong as she pulled him toward a side corridor. Taurian followed without a word. As soon as they were out of the ballroom and into the dimly lit passage, she spun on him. "Do you have any idea what you just did?" Elias leaned against the smooth, crystalline wall, crossing his arms. "Yeah, saved your plan from falling apart. You're welcome." She took a sharp step closer. "You escalated it," he arched a brow. "Oh, I'm sorry, was I supposed to refuse, because I don't think that would have gone over well with your mother." Zalara exhaled sharply, turning away for a moment as if forcing herself to regain composure. Taurian, ever the silent observer, finally spoke. "The Queen's decree changes everything. If the engagement is recognized by law, breaking it would be seen as dishonorable, political suicide." Elias frowned. "You didn't think she'd take it that far?" Zalara's jaw tightened. "I underestimated how quickly she would act." "Great," Elias said dryly. "So now I'm not just your fake fiancé, I'm your legally recognized one." She shot him a glare, but there was something in her eyes, something uneasy. He saw the calculation, the weight of what had just happened pressing down on her. Taurian folded his arms. "It does solidify your position, however. If Doran had plans to undermine the claim, they are now significantly more complicated." Elias sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "Fantastic. So now I just have to survive court politics, assassination attempts, and whatever other surprises this place has to offer." Zalara hesitated for half a second before speaking. "We will ensure your safety." He looked at her then, at the way her usual icy resolve had thinned just slightly at the edges. Something about that softened his tone. "Guess we're in this together, huh?" She held his gaze for a beat longer than necessary. Then, without another word, she turned on her heel and started walking. Elias pushed off the wall and followed, Taurian moving beside him. He had no idea what the next step was, but one thing was clear. This was no longer just a game. Elias had been in strange situations before. He talked his way out of gang disputes in the outer colonies, sweet-talked bureaucrats on corrupt trade stations, even outplayed a warlord in a high-stakes bluff. But nothing quite prepared him for being escorted through the royal palace as the official fiancé of an alien princess. The halls shimmered with soft bioluminescent light, casting intricate patterns along the crystalline walls. Servants and guards watched him with cautious curiosity, as if they were still trying to decide what to make of him. He could hardly blame them. He was trying to figure that out himself. Zalara walked ahead with perfect posture, her pace brisk, expression unreadable. Taurian remained at Elias' side, ever the silent guardian. Elias finally broke the silence. "So where exactly are we going?" "To your new chambers," Zalara said without turning. "If you are to be my fiancé, you must reside within the palace." "Right," Elias muttered. "Because that's not going to make me an even bigger target or anything." Zalara stopped abruptly, turning to face him. "You were already a target the moment you accepted." Her tone was sharp, but beneath it, Elias caught something else. A flicker of concern buried deep. Taurian cleared his throat. "The princess is correct. Doran will not act openly, but he will probe for weaknesses. He will test you, find the cracks in your story and your resolve. You must be prepared for that." Elias exhaled. "Yeah, well, I'm getting the feeling that cracking under pressure isn't much of an option here." Zalara studied him for a moment before nodding. "Good. Then understand this. Our engagement is no longer a convenient strategy. It is a reality the court will test at every turn. If you falter, if they sense even the slightest hesitation, we lose everything." Elias smirked. "So no pressure." She didn't return the humor. Instead, she simply turned and continued walking. Few minutes later, they arrived at an elaborate set of doors embedded with silver filigree. They slid open silently, revealing a chamber that was, by any standard, excessive. A high ceiling arched overhead, glowing with soft ambient light. The walls seemed to shift subtly, their crystalline structure responding to movement. A massive bed rested in the center, draped in dark blue fabric threaded with iridescent patterns. The entire space was elegant, refined, and most importantly, very much not his style. "Well," Elias muttered, stepping inside, "this is a definite upgrade from my usual accommodations." Zalara entered behind him, arms crossed. "Everything here is secure. The guards will patrol outside and a security field will alert us to any unauthorized entry." Elias turned, brow raised. "You really think someone going to break in?" She met his gaze without hesitation. "I know they will." For a moment, silence stretched between them. Elias searched her expression, trying to gauge whether this was just paranoia or a legitimate concern. Judging by her tone, it was definitely the latter. "All right," he said, rubbing the back of his neck. "So when you said we need to be convincing, I assume that means more than just saying we're engaged." Zalara nodded. "It means being seen together, speaking as one, trusting each other in a way that leaves no room for doubt." Elias exhaled through his nose. Thing about trust, it usually takes more than a day to build. For the first time, Zalara's expression softened just slightly. "Then we will have to accelerate the process." Taurian stepped forward. "There is an event tomorrow, a diplomatic gathering, one where your presence will be expected. It will be the first true test of your role." Elias groaned. "A formal event, great. Do I at least get a guide on royal etiquette, or do I just wing it and hope I don't accidentally insult someone?" Zalara tilted her head. "I will ensure you are prepared." Something about the way she said it made Elias pause. She wasn't just saying it as a duty. There was a quiet certainty in her tone, an unspoken promise that, despite the circumstances, she would not let him fail. "All right," Elias said, finally nodding. "Guess I'd better make myself comfortable then." Zalara lingered for a moment longer before turning to leave. As she stepped through the doorway, she glanced back at him just once. "Rest while you can. Tomorrow everything changes." Then she was gone, leaving Elias alone in the vast, unfamiliar room. He let out a slow breath, rubbing his temples. He had no idea what he'd gotten himself into, but one thing was certain. This wasn't just about playing a part anymore. This was about survival. The air in the grand hall shimmered with an eerie iridescence, a product of the biocrystalline walls humming with quiet energy. Elias had been to fancy events before. Smuggling gigs sometimes required charm, but nothing had prepared him for this. Hundreds of dignitaries, nobles, and off-world ambassadors floated through the vast chamber like planets caught in some unseen gravitational waltz. The music was delicate but otherworldly, a series of overlapping harmonics that seemed to weave in and out of the mind rather than simply being heard. The scent of something floral yet electric tingled at the edge of his senses, and the food, well, Elias wasn't sure if it was meant to be eaten or if it would eat him first. He adjusted the high-collared formal tunic he'd been given. It fit too well, probably designed by some royal AI tailor that measured him without him even realizing. The deep indigo fabric clung to him like a second skin, trimmed with silver sigils that he assumed meant something important. He felt like a fraud wearing it. A thief masquerading as royalty. Zalara stood beside him, poised and unreadable as always. Tonight she was adorned in dark violet fabric that moved like liquid night, catching the glow of the room with every step. A delicate silver circlet rested against her forehead, subtle yet unmistakably regal. The moment they had entered, all eyes had turned to them. The engagement was the only thing people were talking about. Elias leaned in slightly, keeping his voice low. "So, what's the protocol here?" Smile and wave, shake hands, avoid accidentally agreeing to intergalactic war. Zalara didn't look at him, but the slightest twitch at the corner of her lips suggested amusement. Speak little, listen more. If someone asks a question, answer concisely but with certainty. Hesitation breeds weakness. "Right, confidence is key," he murmured. "Luckily, I'm an excellent liar. Let's hope you don't need to be." She started walking and Elias followed, forcing himself into a casual but steady stride. He could feel the stairs pressing against his back like physical weight. He had expected judgment, but what surprised him was the curiosity, the murmurs of speculation. Why a human? Perhaps the princess has grown tired of tradition. "Do you think he understands what he's gotten himself into?" The last voice was familiar. Doran. Elias turned his head just slightly, catching the man's golden-eyed gaze from across the room. He was speaking with a cluster of nobles, his expression one of polite amusement, but his words were meant for them. A test, Elias realized. A provocation. Zalara didn't react, but Elias had a feeling she had heard it too. Fine. If they wanted a performance, he'd give them one. He reached out, not hesitantly, not awkwardly, but naturally, and took Zalara's hand. The action sent a ripple through the crowd, subtle but unmistakable. The princess did not openly display affection, and yet here she was, allowing a human to hold her hand as if it were the most ordinary thing in the world. He felt the slightest stiffening in her posture, a hesitation so brief it was almost imperceptible. But then she responded. Her fingers curled against his ever so slightly, a silent acknowledgement of the move he had just played. Doran's smile thinned. "That's right, you bastard," Elias thought. "We're convincing." A moment later, a woman approached them, her presence commanding in a way that had nothing to do with her appearance and everything to do with the air of authority around her. "Princess Zelara," the woman said smoothly, inclining her head. "And your fiancé." Elias smiled, releasing Zelara's hand only to place it against his chest in what he hoped passed for a respectful greeting. "Elias Cross," he introduced himself. "A pleasure." The woman's gaze was sharp, appraising. "I am Lady Vedra, Minister of Intergalactic Relations." Zelara inclined her head slightly. "Minister, I must admit I was surprised by the news," Vedra continued, "but I find myself intrigued. A human consort is unprecedented in our history. Some view it as bold, others as reckless." Elias maintained his easy smile. "Funny thing about history, it has to change sometime." Vedra's lips curved slightly as if entertained. "A very human sentiment." Zelara's voice was calm but firm. "Elias is more than capable of navigating this role." "Oh, I don't doubt his ability to navigate," Vedra mused. "But navigation is one thing, belonging is another." Elias met her gaze evenly. "I guess that's up to me to prove, isn't it?" Vedra held his gaze for a moment longer before nodding slightly. "Indeed, we shall see." Then, turning to Zelara, she added, "I look forward to watching this unfold, princess." That she moved on, vanishing back into the swirl of diplomatic conversation. Elias let out a slow breath. "That wasn't stressful at all." Zelara exhaled through her nose. "You handled it well." "High praise," he muttered. "Does that mean I get to keep my head for another day?" Her lips twitched, but before she could respond, another figure approached. This time it was one of the palace attendants, bowing slightly. "Your Highness, there is a matter requiring your attention." Zelara's expression hardened. "What kind of matter?" The attendant hesitated. Elias frowned. "That's never a good sign." "Perhaps it would be best if you saw for yourself," the attendant finally said. Zelara exchanged a glance with Elias before giving a single nod. "Lead the way." Elias followed, instincts on edge. Whatever this was, it wasn't part of the planned performance, and that meant trouble. The corridors leading away from the grand hall were eerily quiet. The distant hum of palace energy fields the only sound as Elias followed Zelara and the attendant through the winding crystalline passageways. Something about the shift in atmosphere put him on edge. The air felt heavier, charged with unspoken tension. Zelara walked with purpose, her usual poised elegance now sharpened with something colder, anticipation, or maybe dread. Elias wasn't sure which was worse. They stopped before a set of doors guarded by two royal sentinels clad in dark metallic armor, their visors glowing faintly. The moment they saw Zelara, they bowed and stepped aside. The attendant pressed a panel on the wall, and the doors slid open, revealing a chamber bathed in dim, pulsing blue light. Inside, bound to a containment chair with shimmering restraints that pulsed in time with the room's security fields, was a man, human, rough around the edges, his clothes dusted with the grime of long interstellar travel. His wrists were clamped to the chair's armrests, though he didn't struggle. Instead, he grinned the moment he saw Elias. "Well, I'll be damned," the man said, voice full of amusement. "Elias Cross dressed up like royalty. Never thought I'd see the day." Elias exhaled sharply. "You have got to be kidding me." Zelara glanced at him sharply. "You know him?" Elias ran a hand down his face. "Unfortunately." The man's grin widened. "Oh, come on, Elias, don't act like you're not happy to see me." He shifted in his restraints, clearly as comfortable as someone could be while bound to an interrogation chair. "I mean, you did leave me stranded on the Kelvani drift without so much as a farewell." Elias crossed his arms. "And yet you're still alive. You're welcome." The man laughed. "Fair enough." Then, turning his attention to Zelara, he tilted his head slightly. "And you must be the famous Princess Zelara. I gotta say, the rumors don't do you justice." Zelara regarded him coolly. "Who are you?" "Call me Rix," he said easily. "Freelancer, occasional smuggler, unfortunate acquaintance of Elias Cross." Zelara's expression didn't change. And what is your business here, Rix? That, Rix said, shifting slightly, is a long and complicated story. But the short version, I came here to warn you. Elia's jaw tight. Oh, this should be good, Rix sighed dramatically. Look, I know you probably want to toss me into the nearest airlock, but trust me, this concerns both of you. His gaze flicked between them. And your little engagement. Zalara stepped forward. Explain. Rix leaned back in his restraints as if debating how much to say. Then his usual smirk faded slightly. Someone hired me to dig up dirt on your engagement, he said. Find weaknesses, find lies. His gaze flicked to Elia's. Imagine my surprise when I found out the groom-to-be wasn't exactly part of the royal bloodline. Elias felt Zalara go rigid beside him. Who? She asked, voice cool but edged with steel. Rix exhaled through his nose. Take a wild guess. Elias already knew the answer before Rix said it. Doran. Rix gave a mock bow from his seated position. The one and only. Zalara's expression remained unreadable, but Elias could practically feel the temperature in the room drop. How much does he know? She asked. Enough to be suspicious, Rix admitted. He doesn't have proof, but he's fishing for it, and he's getting close. If you two slip up even once, he'll have exactly what he needs to tear this whole thing apart. Elias clenched his jaw. He had known this was coming, but hearing it out loud made it feel a whole lot worse. Zalara turned to him, her gaze steady. We need to be more careful. Elias nodded. Agreed. Then glancing back at Rix, he exhaled. And what do you get out of this? You don't exactly have a reputation for charity. Rix smirked. True, but I also know when I'm on the losing side of a deal. If Doran wins, he sure as hell isn't letting me walk away. I figured I'd take my chances with you two instead. Zalara studied him for a long moment, then turned to the royal guards. Release him. The guards hesitated but obeyed, the shimmering restraints dissipating as Rix rolled his shoulders with a groan. Now, Rix, Zalara said smoothly, you're going to tell us everything Doran has done so far, every move he's made, every person he's spoken to. Rix rubbed his wrists, grinning. See, this is why I like you. Zalara's voice remained cold. Don't mistake necessity for trust. Elias sighed. Great. Another headache. He had a feeling things were about to get a whole lot worse. Rix stretched his arms as though shaking off the remnants of his brief imprisonment, then leaned against the nearest wall like he owned the place. All right, I'll tell you what I know, but I expect a little gratitude, or at least a drink. Zalara's expression didn't shift. You'll get nothing until you prove your information is useful. Rix let out a dramatic sigh. You royals, so demanding. Elias crossed his arms. Start talking, Rix. Before I start regretting not leaving you on the Calvani drift again. Rix smirked but relented. Fine, here's the situation. Doran doesn't just suspect you two are faking it. He knows something off. He's been digging into your past, Elias, trying to figure out why a no-name human suddenly became the love of the princess's life. He tilted his head. You don't exactly have a spotless record. Elias rolled his eyes. Neither do you, and yet you're standing here. Touché, Rix admitted. But the difference is I know how to cover my tracks. You've got a list of old enemies longer than a Varkali warship. Zalara's gaze sharpened. Who has Doran spoken to? Bounty hunters, information brokers, some off-world officials who would love to discredit you. And Rix hesitated just slightly before continuing. The High Council. Elias felt Zalara's body stiffen beside him. The High Council. The ruling body that in many ways had more authority than even the royal family. If Doran had managed to gain their ear, this was more dangerous than either of them had anticipated. Zalara took a step forward, her voice dangerously soft. You're certain? As certain as I am about Elias being the second most frustrating human I know. Rix grinned, but it didn't reach his eyes. They haven't acted yet, but if Doran can present them with solid proof that your engagement is a sham, they will. Elias exhaled through his nose. Great, just great. Zalara remained silent for a long moment, then turned to one of the royal guards. Have my personal security detail monitor all council communications. Any mention of Doran or my engagement is to be flagged and reported to me immediately. The guard bowed and left without question. Elias studied Zalara's expression carefully. She was calm, too calm. The kind of calm that only came when someone was holding back the full weight of their thoughts. What's our next move? He asked. Zalara lifted her chin slightly. We do what we intended to do from the beginning. Rix blinked. Which is, we convince them. Elias raised a brow. Convince who? Zalara met his gaze, her expression unreadable. Everyone, Rix whistled. You're talking about taking this deception all the way to the top. Zalara didn't flinch. If we are to survive this, we must remove all doubt. Elias couldn't help but laugh under his breath. So what? You want to make it even more believable? Zalara nodded once. Yes, that means public appearances, increased intimacy, a display so unquestionable that even Doran will be forced to reconsider his own suspicions. Elias ran a hand through his hair. You do realize what that means, right? Zalara's voice remained steady. Yes. Rix, meanwhile, looked far too entertained by the whole situation. Well, this just got interesting. Elias exhaled. So, let me get this straight. The plan is to sell this engagement harder than ever. Make the entire universe believe we're actually in love, Zalara nodded again. Precisely. Elias shook his head with a smirk. You really are a princess with a death wish. She tilted her head slightly. Do you doubt your ability to play the part? Elias met her gaze, something unreadable passing between them. Then, without breaking eye contact, he reached out and took her hand, this time with slow deliberation. I never back down from a challenge, he murmured. For the briefest moment, something flickered behind Zalara's normally impenetrable expression. But then, just as quickly, she masked it. Rix clapped his hands together. All right, lovebirds, if you're going all in on this, I suppose I should stick around. Someone gotta make sure you two don't slip up. Elias groaned. Oh, wonderful. Zalara ignored them both. Prepare yourself, Elias. From this moment forward, there can be no hesitation. Elias squeezed her hand just slightly before letting go. Then let's give them a show they'll never forget. Because if they failed, it wouldn't just be their reputations on the line, it would be their lives. The next morning, the palace buzzed with renewed energy. Word of the princess's upcoming public appearance had spread fast, and already preparations were underway. Servants hurried through the crystalline halls, attending to last-minute details, while members of the royal court whispered about the unprecedented display that was about to unfold. Elias adjusted the high-collared jacket he'd been given, ornate, deep blue with intricate silver embroidery along the cuffs, a design meant to complement Zalara's own attire. It felt stiff, unnatural, like wearing someone else's skin. He caught his reflection in the mirror, barely recognizing himself in the regal ensemble. Damn, Rix muttered from behind him, leaning against the doorframe. You almost look respectable. Elias rolled his eyes. I assume you're here for a reason, Rix smirked. Just came to remind you that the moment you step out there, you're officially the galaxy's favorite fiancé. No pressure. Elias turned to face him fully. Any updates on Doran? Rix shrugged. No big moves yet. He's waiting, watching, probably hoping you screw this up on your own. Elias exhaled sharply. Then we can't give him the satisfaction. Before Rix could respond, a knock at the door interrupted them. The moment Elias opened it, he found himself face to face with Zalara. She was dressed in a ceremonial gown of flowing silver and deep violet, her hair woven into an intricate crown-like arrangement. She looked every bit the princess she was, untouchable, effortless, and impossibly composed. But beneath the mask of royalty, Elias caught the smallest flicker of something else. Determination. Are you ready? She asked. Elias didn't hesitate. Always. Zalara studied him for a second longer before offering a small nod. Then let's go. The moment they stepped out onto the palace's grand balcony, the sound of the crowd below struck them like a wave. Thousands of voices murmured, their collective anticipation crackling through the air. The entire city had gathered for this, eager to witness their princess and her human fiancé, an unprecedented pairing, one that had captivated the Empire's attention. Elias stood beside Zalara, maintaining the perfect posture expected of him. The royal attendants moved seamlessly around them, ensuring everything was in place, while the High Chancellor stepped forward to address the crowd. His words were elegant, rehearsed, a formal declaration of unity, peace, and the Empire's unwavering strength. Elias only half listened. His attention was focused elsewhere on Zalara's hand resting delicately at her side. This was the moment that mattered, the moment they had to convince everyone. Without hesitation, he reached for her hand, intertwining their fingers in full view of the thousands gathered below. The touch was careful, deliberate, his grip firm yet natural, and Zelara, to her credit, did not flinch. Instead, she turned toward him with a look so effortlessly composed that anyone watching would believe it had been her idea. A whisper passed through the crowd. The cameras adjusted, zooming in, capturing the moment. Then, Elias did something that even he hadn't planned. He lifted their joined hands and pressed a slow, reverent kiss against her knuckles. Zelara inhaled so softly that no one else would have noticed. The crowd erupted into applause. It was the reaction they needed. Zelara turned back to face the people, her voice carrying over the comms with practiced elegance. She spoke of unity, of the future, of the strength that came not from bloodlines but from shared purpose. It was a speech designed to solidify her authority, and by extension, Elias' place at her side. And yet, even as she spoke, Elias could feel the weight of her gaze shifting toward him. He didn't look at her directly, not yet, but he could feel it, a silent understanding passing between them. They had won this moment, but the war was far from over. The celebrations lasted well into the evening, an orchestrated display of unity and strength. Lavish feasts, music that resonated through the towering spires of the capital, and endless toasts to the future of the empire, all serving as distractions, carefully woven into the narrative Zelara needed to craft. But beneath the spectacle, beneath the elegant smiles and rehearsed gestures, tension simmered. Elias could feel it in the way Zelara's fingers remained lightly curled around his arm as they moved through the grand hall, how she never let go for longer than necessary. To the outside world, it was an unconscious display of affection, but to Elias, it was something else. A constant, silent reminder that they were being watched. "You're holding on awfully tight," he murmured, keeping his own expression neutral as he leaned slightly toward her. Zelara's gaze didn't waver as she nodded politely to a passing dignitary. "Would you prefer I let go?" Elias smirked. "Depends, would you?" Her fingers didn't loosen. "Didn't think so," he whispered. A nearby court official approached, an older Kelvani woman draped in deep crimson robes, her eyes sharp and calculating. "Your Highness," she greeted, bowing slightly. Then her gaze flicked to Elias. "And your charming fiancé." Elias gave a practiced, easy smile. "Charmed, I'm sure." The woman studied him for a moment before addressing Zelara again. "I must say, the two of you make quite the spectacle. A human at the side of a future empress. It is unprecedented." Zelara's expression remained unreadable. The future is often shaped by what has never been done before. The woman hummed thoughtfully. "Indeed, though I imagine there are many who question the sincerity of this arrangement. The High Council, for example, is not so easily swayed by public displays." Elias felt Zelara's grip tighten, just slightly but enough for him to notice. The woman smiled, too polite to be genuine. "Of course, I wish you both well. After all, the empire thrives on stability." She bowed again and moved on, her presence lingering even after she was gone. Elias exhaled through his nose. "Charming woman." "She's right about one thing," Zelara muttered, her voice quieter now. "The council won't be satisfied with a single performance." Elias glanced at her, reading the tension in her posture. "Then we'll give them more." Zelara turned to him fully now, searching his face. "You're certain?" Elias didn't hesitate. "I didn't sign up for this just to back out when things got complicated." Something flickered in her expression, something unreadable, before she finally nodded. Rix chose that moment to reappear, sliding into step beside them with his usual lack of subtlety. "Well, that was interesting," he drawled, watching the woman's retreating figure. "You do realize she's going to report everything you just said, right?" Zelara didn't look surprised. "I expected nothing less." Rix gave a low whistle. "Then I hope you've got a hell of a next move, because the moment the council gets involved, things get tricky." Elias smirked. "I thought you liked tricky." "Oh, I do," Rix admitted. "I just prefer when it's not my neck on the line." Zelara exhaled, her gaze scanning the hall. "We proceed as planned, public appearances, strengthening the illusion," and she hesitated, her tone shifting almost imperceptibly, "convincing them that this is real." Elias raised a brow. "How real are we talking?" Her eyes met his. The answer was clear, real enough that no one, not the council, not Doran, not the empire itself, would dare question it. As the weeks passed, the tension surrounding Zelara and Elias' engagement only grew, but so did the appearance of their bond. They became fixtures in the palace and in public, seemingly inseparable. Every appearance, every photo op, every whispered conversation was designed to solidify the narrative. But the closer Ilias grew to Zelara, the more complicated their arrangement became. What had begun as a strategic alliance, a charade to appease the masses and shield them both from political disaster, was starting to blur the lines. The moments when they weren't in front of an audience began to feel just as real as the ones they played for the cameras. The quiet dinners, the shared laughter over something trivial, the fleeting glances that spoke volumes. Ilias knew it was dangerous. He was getting too close to someone he couldn't afford to care about, someone who had no room for him in her world once this was over. But the heart had a way of complicating things. One evening, after a particularly grueling round of political meetings and public events, Zelara and Ilias found themselves in the palace gardens. The air was cooler now, the first hints of autumn settling in across the empire. The setting sun bathed the garden in a golden glow, casting long shadows against the statues and fountains. It was quiet here, peaceful even, a rare moment of respite. Ilias had always found the gardens to be one of the few places where Zelara seemed human. Not a princess, not an empress-to-be, but just a woman. And tonight, as they walked side by side, there was no act to put on. No audience. No political stakes. Just the two of them. Zelara's voice broke the silence. "You're thinking too much again." Ilias chuckled softly. "You've been reading my mind." She stopped walking and turned to face him. "I'm beginning to understand you." Ilias didn't meet her gaze immediately, instead focusing on the path before them. "That's dangerous." Zelara tilted her head, her expression soft but unreadable. "Is it?" Ilias met her eyes then, unable to mask the tension in his gaze. "For both of us, yeah." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The only sounds were the rustling leaves and the distant chatter of palace staff. And then Zelara took a step closer, her presence magnetic. The air between them shifted, charged with something neither of them could ignore. "I never wanted this to be easy," she whispered. Ilias' heart skipped a beat, his mind racing. "What do you want, Zelara?" Her eyes searched his, the unspoken weight of the question hanging between them. "I want everything to be real. I want the empire to be safe. I want my future." Her voice faltered just for a moment. But then, as if to steady herself, she reached up, touching his cheek gently. "And I want to know if you're still here for the long haul." Ilias' breath caught in his throat. The intensity of her gaze held him captive. He had known from the start that their connection was fragile, a delicate thread suspended between duty and desire. But now, with the weight of her touch lingering on his skin, he could feel the impossibility of the situation in his bones. "I'm here," he said, his voice quieter than usual. Zelara's lips parted, but before she could respond, a sharp voice interrupted them. "Your Highness." It was Doran. Ilias turned to see the man standing at the edge of the garden, his posture rigid, his eyes narrowing at the sight of them. Zelara immediately pulled her hand away from Ilias' cheek, smoothing down her gown as though the moment had never happened. She turned to face Doran with practiced grace. "What is it, Doran?" He bowed stiffly, but there was no mistaking the suspicion in his eyes. "I've come to inform you that the council has decided to meet tomorrow to discuss the validity of your engagement, Your Highness." Ilias' stomach dropped. He had known it was coming, but hearing it aloud made it all too real. The council. Zelara's voice was steady, but Ilias could feel the shift in her posture. "What exactly are they questioning?" Doran's eyes flicked to Ilias before returning to Zelara. "They are concerned that your engagement is built on a lie, that it is a political strategy rather than a union of true hearts. There are whispers, and the council will not ignore them any longer." Zelara's expression hardened, but she said nothing at first. Ilias could sense the storm brewing beneath her calm exterior. This was it, the moment she had feared, the moment where everything, all their efforts, all their lies could come crashing down. Ilias took a step closer to her, offering her a quiet solidarity. "We'll face them together." Zelara's gaze met his, and for the first time in weeks there was no act, no political facade. Just two people standing in the middle of a garden, their futures uncertain but bound together. She nodded, the weight of her decision settling into her bones. Together. The next day, as they stood before the High Council, the stakes had never been higher. Elias felt the gravity of the moment in every breath, every beat of his heart. There would be no turning back now. They were in this, all of it together, and the world would have to believe it.